It was a stormy night when everything in my life changed. I had always trusted her, my wife, my partner for years. But little did I know, the woman I loved more than anything was weaving a web of deceit that would span continents and turn my world upside down. The rain pelted against the window panes of our suburban home, a steady rhythm that had always brought me comfort. Tonight, though, it felt different, more ominous, as if the storm was a harbinger of the chaos that was about to unfold in my life. I sat in our living room, nursing a cup of coffee, the warmth of the mug doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. Sarah, my wife of 10 years, was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared dinner. She looked as she always did, effortlessly beautiful, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, her green eyes sparkling with a contentment that I had always envied. She had a way of making the mundane seem magical, whether it was setting the table or simply talking about her day. It was one of the many reasons I had fallen in love with her. We had met in college, a typical story of two young people drawn to each other in a whirlwind romance. She was studying art, and I was deep into my engineering degree. Despite our different interests, we clicked instantly, our chemistry undeniable. After graduation, we married and settled into what I thought was a blissful life. Over the years, we built our life together, bought a house, established careers, and even started talking about starting a family. Sarah had always been the organized one, handling our finances and making sure everything ran smoothly. I trusted her completely, never once questioning her decisions or actions. After all, why would I? She was my partner, my confidant, my everything. But that night, as the storm raged outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was a gnawing sensation, deep in my gut, that had started weeks ago but had grown more intense recently. I dismissed it as paranoia, the product of a stressed mind, but it persisted, nagging at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. Sarah's humming drifted from the kitchen, a sweet melodic sound that once filled me with happiness. But tonight, it felt different. Hollow, almost forced. I watched her as she moved gracefully between the stove and the counter, her back turned to me. She seemed perfectly at ease, as if nothing in the world could disturb her peace. But there were signs, subtle ones, that I had noticed over the past few weeks. The way she spent more time on her phone, often smiling at messages she would never share with me. The way she'd become distant, our conversations growing shorter and less meaningful. And then there was the occasional late night out with friends I'd never met, or the excuses that seemed too convenient. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as my imagination running wild. But the more I tried, the more the doubts crept in. There were moments when I would catch her staring off into the distance, her mind clearly elsewhere. When I asked her about it, she would smile and say she was just tired, or that she had a lot on her mind. I wanted to believe her, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The real turning point came one afternoon when I came home from work earlier than usual. I had planned to surprise her with dinner, something I rarely had the time to do. But as I walked through the front door, I heard her voice from the living room, soft, almost a whisper. She was on the phone, and there was an intimacy in her tone that made me stop in my tracks. "I can't wait to see you again," she was saying, her voice filled with a warmth that sent a shiver down my spine. "I miss you so much." I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing, didn't want to acknowledge the betrayal that was unfolding right in front of me. But there it was, plain as day. She was talking to someone else, someone she clearly had feelings for. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding all at once. Who was she talking to? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, why? What had I done, or failed to do, that had pushed her into the arms of another man? Before I could gather my thoughts, Sarah noticed me standing there. She quickly ended the call, her face flushing with a mixture of surprise and guilt. "Oh, you're home early," she said, her voice unnaturally bright. "I was just talking to a friend." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "A friend, huh?" Sounded pretty serious. She laughed, but it was strained, lacking the carefree joy that used to define her. "Just catching up, you know how it is." I nodded, but inside, I was anything but calm. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, hurt, anger, confusion. I wanted to confront her right then and there, demand answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear, fear of what I would hear, fear of the truth that was slowly unraveling in front of me. Instead, I played along, pretending that everything was fine. But that night, as we sat down to dinner, the air between us felt thick with unspoken tension. The conversation was forced, punctuated by long silences that neither of us knew how to fill. I could see it in her eyes. She knew I suspected something, but she wasn't ready to admit it. As the night wore on, I found myself questioning everything. Every word she said, every gesture, every look. Was it all a lie? Had our entire marriage been nothing more than a facade, a perfect image hiding the rot beneath? The doubt gnawed at me, refusing to let go. When we finally went to bed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the storm continued to rage outside. Sarah slept peacefully beside me, or at least pretended to. I could hear her breathing, slow and even, but I knew she was awake, just as I was. There was a chasm between us now, one that had grown too wide to ignore. That night, for the first time in our marriage, I felt truly alone. The days following that stormy night were a blur of confusion, suspicion, and a gnawing sense of betrayal that I couldn't shake. Sarah continued to act as though nothing had changed, her bright smile and warm demeanor masking the deceit I had overheard. But for me, everything was different. My trust in her, once unshakable, had cracked, and I found myself questioning every word, every action, every moment we shared. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the phone call I had overheard was innocent, just a conversation between friends. But the doubt persisted, whispering in the back of my mind, growing louder with each passing day. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came about a week later. Sarah had always been meticulous with our finances. She handled the bills, the investments, everything. I trusted her completely with our money, never once feeling the need to check up on her. But something had changed. She started becoming secretive about our financial situation, dodging my questions and brushing off any concerns I raised. One evening, I noticed that our mail, usually organized neatly on the kitchen counter, had been moved. Sarah had always made a habit of opening the mail as soon as it arrived, sorting it into piles, bills, letters, advertisements. But now, I found that certain pieces of mail were missing. Bank statements, credit card bills, things that she would normally show me were nowhere to be found. When I asked her about it, she shrugged it off, claiming that she had gone paperless and was handling everything online. She even showed me a few emails on her phone, proof that the bills were being paid. But something about the way she quickly changed the subject, the way she avoided meeting my eyes, set off alarm bells in my mind. I couldn't let it go. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I crept downstairs and opened her laptop. I knew it was an invasion of her privacy, but the nagging doubt had grown too strong to ignore. I needed answers. As I navigated through her emails and bank accounts, my heart began to race. There were transactions I didn't recognize, large sums of money being transferred to accounts I had never heard of. Items of value were being sold, things I had no idea were even up for sale. My prized watch, a gift from my father, was listed on an online auction site, along with other personal belongings that held sentimental value. It was as if Sarah was slowly, methodically stripping away everything I owned, everything we had built together. I confronted her the next morning, my anger barely contained. "Sarah, what the hell is going on? Why are you selling our things without telling me?" She looked at me with wide eyes, her expression a mixture of surprise and guilt. But then, as quickly as the guilt appeared, it was replaced by a calm, almost dismissive smile. "Oh, that. I'm sorry, I should have told you. We needed the money for some unexpected expenses, and I thought it would be easier to handle it myself." "Unexpected expenses?" I asked, incredulous. "Like what? And why didn't you discuss this with me?" She sighed, her patience seemingly thinning. "It's not a big deal, really. I just didn't want to worry you. We're fine. I've got everything under control." But we weren't fine. I could see it now, the cracks in her facade, the lies she was weaving to cover up something far more sinister. Her reassurances did nothing to quell the growing sense of dread in my chest. In fact, they only made it worse. As the days passed, Sarah's behavior grew more erratic. She became distant, often lost in thought, her mind clearly elsewhere. Our conversations, once full of warmth and affection, were now stilted and awkward. She stopped asking about my day, stopped sharing the little details of hers. It was as if she had mentally checked out of our marriage, her focus entirely on something or someone else. I noticed other changes too. She started dressing differently, paying more attention to her appearance than usual. She'd spend hours in front of the mirror, applying makeup, styling her hair, choosing outfits that were more revealing, more daring. When I asked her if she was meeting someone, she would laugh it off, but the laughter didn't reach her eyes. And then there were the late nights. Sarah had always been a homebody, preferring quiet evenings at home to nights out. But now, she began going out more often, claiming she was meeting friends from work or attending some event or another. She never invited me to join her, and when I offered, she'd make some excuse about it being a girls' night or something similar. One night, she came home late, much later than usual. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair a mess, and she had a strange, almost guilty look in her eyes. She didn't offer any explanation, just mumbled something about a long night and went straight to bed. I lay awake that night, my mind racing with questions, suspicions, fears. The final straw came when I noticed a change in her phone habits. Sarah had always been open with her phone, leaving it around the house, never worrying if I saw her texts or calls. But now, she kept it close, never letting it out of her sight. She'd take it with her to the bathroom, to bed, even when she was just walking from one room to another. One evening, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the counter. Without thinking, I picked it up and glanced at the screen. It was a message from someone named Mark. "Can't wait to see you again. Miss you." My heart dropped. There it was, the confirmation of everything I had feared. She was having an affair. But this wasn't just any affair. It was something deeper, something darker. The texts between them were intimate, filled with promises of a future together. They talked about places I'd never heard of, plans I had no knowledge of. It was clear that they were planning something that involved leaving me behind. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I scrolled through the messages, each one more damning than the last. She was selling our possessions to fund their escape, draining our accounts to start a new life with this man. And I had been completely oblivious, blind to the betrayal happening right under my nose. When Sarah came out of the shower, I confronted her, holding her phone out like a weapon. "Who the hell is Mark?" She froze, her face draining of color as she realized what I had seen. For a moment, she looked like she might try to deny it, to spin some lie that would make it all go away. But then, something in her seemed to break. She slumped against the wall, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for it to get this far." But it had, and there was no turning back now. As I stood there, my world crumbling around me, I realized that the woman I had loved and trusted for a decade was a stranger, someone who had lied to me, betrayed me, and was planning to leave me with nothing. The perfect facade had shattered, and all that was left was the cold, harsh reality of her betrayal. But as I spoke with the lawyer, laying out the details of what had happened, I realized that legal action alone wouldn't be enough. Sarah was too smart, too prepared. She had covered her tracks too well. I needed help. Help that went beyond the confines of the law. That's when I thought of Alex, my old friend from college who had gone on to join the CIA. We hadn't spoken in years, our lives having taken very different paths, but I knew he was the only person who could help me now. I wasn't sure if he would be willing or even able to assist, but I had no other choice. With a trembling hand, I dialed his number, praying that he would answer. To my relief, he picked up on the second ring, his voice as calm and steady as I remembered. "Alex, it's me," I said, my voice shaking. "I need your help. It's about Sarah." As I explained the situation, laying out everything I had discovered, I could hear the seriousness in his tone. He asked for details, dates, and specifics, his questions precise and methodical. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he spoke. "I'll see what I can do. But you need to be prepared, man. This isn't just about money or betrayal. This is something bigger, something more dangerous. You need to be ready for whatever comes next." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I knew he was right. Sarah had gone to extraordinary lengths to cover her tracks, to ensure that she would get away with everything. And if I wanted to stop her, I had to be willing to go just as far. As I hung up the phone, I knew that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. The woman I had loved, the life I had built, were all gone. In their place was a new reality, one where I had to fight, not just for my money or my reputation, but for my very survival. The shocking discovery of Sarah's betrayal had set me on a path I never thought I'd have to walk. And as I prepared for the battle ahead, I knew that there was no turning back. The days that followed were some of the darkest I'd ever experienced. Every waking moment was consumed by thoughts of Sarah and Mark, and the betrayal that had turned my world upside down. But beneath the pain, a new resolve began to form, a determination to track them down, to confront Sarah, and to make her face the consequences of her actions. After my conversation with Alex, my old college friend turned CIA operative, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had promised to help, and I knew he was someone who could deliver. But I also knew that this wasn't going to be easy. Sarah had planned her escape meticulously, covering her tracks and leaving behind as little evidence as possible. If I was going to find her, I had to be smart, methodical, and relentless. The first step was to gather as much information as possible. I spent hours going through Sarah's emails, texts, and bank records, piecing together a timeline of her activities. I followed the money trail, tracking the transfers she had made to various accounts, both domestic and offshore. Each transaction, each withdrawal was another clue, another piece of the puzzle that would eventually lead me to her. Alex had advised me to stay low, to avoid making any moves that might tip Sarah off. If she realized I was onto her, she could disappear completely, making it impossible for me to find her. So I played my part, going about my daily routine as if nothing had changed, while secretly working behind the scenes to unravel her web of lies. During this time, Alex kept in touch, providing me with updates and guidance. He had tapped into some of his old contacts, using his skills to dig deeper into Sarah's activities. The information he provided was invaluable. Details about the offshore accounts, the properties she and Mark had looked into, and even a potential alias she was planning to use once she left the country. It was clear that Sarah and Mark were planning to flee the country and that they had chosen China as their destination. It made sense. China was a vast, densely populated country where they could easily disappear, blending into the crowds and starting a new life far away from me and everything they had left behind. With this knowledge in hand, I began to focus my efforts on tracking their movements. I hired a private investigator, someone with experience in tracing fugitives and tracking down people who didn't want to be found. Together, we started monitoring flight records, looking for any indication that Sarah and Mark had already left the country. But Sarah was smart, too smart. She hadn't used her real name on any of the tickets, and the alias she had chosen was so generic that it was nearly impossible to pinpoint. The frustration began to build, the sense of urgency growing with each passing day. I knew that time was running out, that if I didn't find her soon, she would be gone for good. And then, just as I was starting to lose hope, I got a call from Alex. "I've got something," he said, his voice urgent. "It's not much, but it's a lead. I've been monitoring travel patterns, looking for anything unusual. There's a private jet that left a small airfield just outside the city a few days ago, heading to Beijing. The passenger list is sparse, but one of the names matches the alias Sarah's been using." My heart skipped a beat. This was the break I had been waiting for, the first real lead that could bring me closer to finding Sarah. "I'm on it," I replied, already grabbing my coat and keys. "What's the plan?" "We need to move fast," Alex said. "I've already arranged for some contacts in Beijing to start looking into it, but I need you to be ready. If they're in China, they're not going to stay in one place for long. You need to be there, on the ground, ready to act." The next few hours were a blur of activity. I booked a last-minute flight to Beijing, packed a small bag, and made arrangements to take an extended leave from work. I couldn't afford to waste any more time. I had to be there, in person, if I was going to have any chance of catching up with Sarah and Mark. As the plane took off, I stared out the window, my mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. I knew that this wasn't going to be easy, that the odds were stacked against me, but I also knew that I couldn't back down now. Sarah had taken everything from me, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The flight was long and exhausting, giving me plenty of time to think about what I was going to do when I finally found them. I ran through 1,000 scenarios in my mind, imagining every possible outcome. Would Sarah try to run again? Would Mark confront me? What would I say to her, to the woman who had once been my everything but had now become my worst enemy? By the time we landed in Beijing, I was exhausted but resolute. I made my way through customs as quickly as possible, eager to get started. Alex had arranged for someone to meet me at the airport, a local contact who would help me navigate the city and track down Sarah. His name was Lee, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, getting straight to the point as we climbed into his car. "Your friend told me everything," he said in heavily accented English. "We've been watching the area where the jet landed, but it's a big city. They could be anywhere." I nodded, appreciating his honesty. I knew this wasn't going to be easy, but at least I had someone on my side who knew the lay of the land. For the next few days, Lee and I scoured the city, following every lead, every whisper of information that might bring us closer to Sarah and Mark. We visited hotels, questioned locals, and even staked out a few places where they were rumored to have been seen. But each lead seemed to fizzle out, leaving us with nothing but frustration. As the days dragged on, my hope began to wane. Beijing was an enormous city, and finding two people who didn't want to be found was like searching for a needle in a haystack. But just when I was starting to despair, we caught a break. Lee had a contact in the local police force, a man who owed him a favor. One evening, as we were sitting in a dimly lit cafe, Lee received a call. His contact had come through. There had been a sighting of a couple matching Sarah and Mark's description at a hotel on the outskirts of the city. My heart raced as Lee relayed the information. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. We had to move quickly before they realized that they had been spotted and disappeared again. We rushed to the hotel, a nondescript building tucked away in a quiet part of town. Lee parked the car a block away, and we approached on foot, trying to stay as inconspicuous as possible. My mind was racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins as we reached the entrance. Lee spoke briefly with the receptionist, flashing some sort of ID that I didn't recognize. After a tense moment, the receptionist nodded and handed him a key card. "They're on the 3rd floor," Lee whispered to me as we headed toward the elevator. "Room 312. As the elevator doors closed, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, fear, anticipation. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment when I would finally come face to face with Sarah. But as much as I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The elevator dinged and the doors slid open, revealing the 3rd floor hallway. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning. We walked down the hall, each step bringing me closer to the room where Sarah and Mark were hiding. When we reached room 312, Lee held up a hand, signaling for me to wait. He leaned in close to the door, listening for any sounds from inside. After a moment, he nodded and handed me the key card. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you ready?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was about to happen. With a nod, I slid the key card into the door, the lock clicking open with a soft beep. I pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn. My eyes quickly adjusted to the darkness, and I saw them, Sarah and Mark, standing by the bed, their faces frozen in shock as they realized who had just walked in. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The three of us stood there, locked in a silent standoff, the air thick with tension. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice trembling as she tried to regain her composure. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All the anger, all the pain I had been holding back for so long came rushing to the surface. I took a step forward, my fists clenched, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark moved to stand in front of Sarah, his posture defensive, as if he was trying to shield her from me. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that they had been caught. "This ends now," I said, my voice low and filled with a cold determination I hadn't known I possessed. "You're not getting away with this." Sarah's face crumpled, her bravado shattering, as she realized there was no escape. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy, no pity. She had made her choice, and now she had to face the consequences. Mark, on the other hand, tried to play the tough guy, stepping forward as if he was going to challenge me. But Lee was quicker, moving between us and putting a hand on Mark's chest, stopping him in his tracks. "You don't want to do that," Lee said calmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mark hesitated, then backed down, his bravado evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. He knew he was outmatched, and there was nothing he could do to change the outcome. The room fell silent again, the weight of the situation settling over us like a heavy blanket. I looked at Sarah, really looked at her, for the first time since I had walked in. The woman standing before me was a stranger, someone I no longer recognized, someone who had shattered my life and left me with nothing but anger and betrayal. But even as I stood there, ready to unleash all the rage and hurt that had been building inside me, something held me back. Maybe it was the realization that nothing I said or did would change what had happened. Or maybe it was the knowledge that this wasn't the end. There were still battles to be fought, still consequences to be faced. "This isn't over," I said finally, my voice steady and resolute. "You're coming back with me, and you're going to answer for what you've done." Sarah didn't respond, her tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Mark looked like he wanted to argue, but one look from Lee silenced him. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door open behind me. Lee followed, keeping a watchful eye on Mark and Sarah as they slowly gathered their things, resigned to their fate. As we made our way back to the car, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The hunt was over, but the journey was far from finished. There would be legal battles, public scrutiny, and the long, difficult process of rebuilding my life. But for now, I had done what I had set out to do. I had found Sarah, and she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The road ahead would be long and hard, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. With Sarah and Mark in custody, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The confrontation in Beijing had been intense, but it was only the beginning of a much longer process. Now that I had them, I needed to bring them back to face the consequences of their actions, both legally and personally. The journey back was tense. Sarah was silent for most of the flight, her eyes fixed on the floor, while Mark alternated between anger and resignation. Lee had ensured that they were securely handled, making it clear that any attempt to escape would be futile. I found myself torn between a deep-seated anger and a strange sense of relief. The woman who had betrayed me so thoroughly was now beside me, but the damage she had done couldn't be undone with her capture. Upon landing, the legal battle began. My lawyer worked tirelessly, gathering the mountain of evidence I had collected. The offshore accounts, the stolen money, the fake identities. Everything was laid bare. Sarah's betrayal was undeniable, and Mark's involvement only sealed their fate. They both faced serious charges, from fraud to conspiracy, and there was little hope of leniency. But beyond the legal aspects, there was the personal reckoning. I had to confront the emotional devastation that Sarah had left in her wake. Our home, once filled with love and trust, was now a symbol of deceit and pain. Friends and family, who had once admired our relationship, now looked on with pity and disbelief. As the court proceedings moved forward, I found myself in a strange place, simultaneously eager for justice and dreading the finality of it all. Sarah's cold, calculating actions had shattered my world, but I knew that holding on to my anger wouldn't bring me peace. The trial was long and grueling, with every detail of our lives laid bare for the public to see. But, in the end, justice was served. Sarah and Mark were both sentenced to prison for their crimes, their plans to start a new life together in ruins. The day of the sentencing was bittersweet. Seeing Sarah led away in handcuffs, I felt a sense of closure, but also a profound sadness for what had been lost. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I could no longer recognize. As I left the courtroom, I knew that the hardest part was yet to come, rebuilding my life from the ground up. But with Sarah's chapter behind me, I could finally begin to heal and move forward. The reckoning was over, but the journey to recovery had just begun. With the trial behind me, I was left with the aftermath of Sarah's betrayal and the chaos it had brought into my life. The once comforting walls of my home now felt suffocating, a constant reminder of the lies and deception that had festered within them. Everywhere I looked, I saw traces of the life we had built together, the life she had destroyed. I knew I couldn't stay in that house. It held too many memories, too much pain. Selling it was a difficult decision, but it was necessary. Letting go of the place where I had envisioned a future with Sarah was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was the first step toward healing. The process was grueling, packing up the remnants of our life together, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. Each item was a reminder of the love we had once shared and of the treachery that had shattered it. But with every box I sealed, I felt a small weight lift from my shoulders. Once the house was sold, I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a place to start over. The quiet solitude of my new home was both comforting and unnerving. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. I had to relearn how to live with myself, to find peace in the silence. Friends and family were supportive, but they couldn't fully understand the depth of my pain. They saw the surface, my calm demeanor, my determination to move on. But beneath it all, I was struggling to rebuild the shattered pieces of my identity. Work became my refuge. Throwing myself into my job helped distract me from the turmoil within, giving me a sense of purpose when everything else felt uncertain. I worked long hours, often late into the night, just to keep my mind occupied. My colleagues noticed the change in me, but they respected my need for space, for time to process everything that had happened. Despite the progress I was making, there were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Moments when the memories of Sarah and the life we had shared would flood back, overwhelming me with sadness and anger. But I refused to let those moments define me. I had already lost so much. I couldn't afford to lose myself in the process. As the weeks turned into months, the pain began to dull, replaced by a quiet resolve. I realized that I didn't need to forget what had happened. I needed to accept it, to learn from it. The betrayal had changed me, but it didn't have to destroy me. I could rebuild, not just my life, but myself, stronger, wiser, and more resilient than before. And so, slowly but surely, I began to pick up the pieces. I reconnected with old friends, started new hobbies, and allowed myself to dream of a future that no longer included Sarah. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but each small victory brought me closer to the person I wanted to be. As time passed, I found myself growing stronger, more confident in the new life I was creating. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined me. I had learned to live with them, to let them be a part of my story without letting them control it. One day, while going through some old boxes, I found a photo album from the early days of my marriage with Sarah. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to revisit those memories. But something compelled me to open it, to look back at the life I had left behind. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a mix of emotions. Nostalgia for the good times, sorrow for what had been lost, but also a sense of closure. These were memories of a life that no longer existed, of a person who no longer held power over me. I realized that I could look at those pictures without anger or bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement of the past and how far I had come since then. That realization marked a turning point for me. It was a sign that I had truly begun to heal, that I was ready to move forward without the weight of the past holding me back. I decided it was time to take a step I had been considering for a while, traveling, seeing the world, and finding out who I was outside of the confines of my old life. I started small, with weekend trips to nearby cities, exploring new places and meeting new people. Each trip was a reminder that there was still so much life to be lived, so many experiences waiting for me. The world was vast, and for the first time in a long while, I felt excited about the possibilities. During one of these trips, I met someone, Emma. She was nothing like Sarah, and that's what drew me to her. She was kind, genuine, and full of life, with a warmth that put me at ease from the moment we met. We started talking, and I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't with anyone since the betrayal. As we got to know each other, I realized that Emma was helping me rediscover parts of myself that I had forgotten. She didn't just see me as the man who had been betrayed. She saw me as the person I was becoming. With her, I felt like I could finally put the past behind me and focus on the future. Our relationship was slow to develop, but that was what I needed. Emma understood my hesitations, my need to take things one step at a time, and as the weeks turned into months, I found myself falling for her, not because she was a replacement for what I had lost, but because she represented something new, something real. With Emma by my side, I began to embrace the idea of new beginnings. The pain of the past would always be a part of me, but it no longer had to define me. I had a future to look forward to, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace it. As I stood at the threshold of this new chapter in my life, I knew that I had been through the worst and come out the other side stronger. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was no longer afraid. I had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, and I had survived. Now, It was time to live. I left them there, in that small town in China, with nothing but the memory of what they had done. I returned home, started from scratch, and slowly began to heal. Sarah and Mark disappeared from my life as quickly as they had come. I never saw them again. But the scars they left remained, a constant reminder of the betrayal and the journey I took to find them. And while I lost everything, I found something far more valuable: myself. In the end, sometimes the only way to move forward is to let go of the past, no matter how painful it may be.